Number 1. The Abandoned Rest Stop. I had been driving for hours with only the sound of the radio and the hum of the engine to keep me company. My eyes were getting heavy and my stomach was rumbling, so I decided to pull off the highway and take a break at the next rest stop. As I approached the rest stop, I noticed something was off. The usual buzz of activity that I had come to expect was missing, and the parking lot was nearly empty. I parked my truck and got out to stretch my legs, looking around to see if anyone else was there. But the place was eerily quiet, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I made my way towards the restrooms, hoping to find something to eat or drink. But as I got closer, I saw that the door was hanging off its hinges, and the interior was in a state of disrepair. I cautiously stepped inside, my senses on high alert. That's when I heard the noises. It sounded like something was shuffling around in the shadows, but I couldn't see anything. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, and I jumped back in alarm. It was a homeless man, his eyes wild and his clothes in tatters. He was living in the restroom, and I could tell that he hadn't had a bath in a while. He started ranting and raving, and I could barely make out what he was saying. I backed up slowly, trying to keep my distance from the homeless man. His appearance was unnerving, with a tangled mess of hair and a beard that reached down to his chest. His clothes were filthy, and his skin was covered in dirt and grime. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. The man continued to rant, his words slurring together. He gestured wildly, pointing towards the broken sinks and toilets. I started to back away, feeling uneasy. I wanted to leave the restroom and get back to my truck, but the man was blocking my way. I tried to reason with him, explaining that I just wanted to use the facilities and then be on my way. But the man wasn't having it. He continued to get more agitated, his eyes growing wider and his voice rising in pitch. I could tell he was becoming increasingly unpredictable, and I knew that I needed to get out of there fast. As I tried to edge my way past him, the man suddenly lunged towards me, grabbing onto my arm. I felt a jolt of fear run through me, unsure of what he was going to do. I struggled to break free, but he was surprisingly strong. "What do you want from me?" I yelled, trying to fight him off. The man didn't answer, just continued to grip my arm with a fierce intensity. I felt an urge of panic rising within me, unsure of how I was going to get out of this situation. But then, a sudden wave of calm washed over me. I remembered the self-defense training I had taken before becoming a truck driver, and I knew that I could handle myself if I needed to. I took a deep breath and used all my strength to break free from the man's grip. He stumbled back, looking surprised at my sudden burst of strength. Without hesitation, I turned and ran out of the restroom, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, just kept running until I reached my truck. I climbed into the safety of my truck and locked the doors behind me. Taking a moment to catch my breath, my mind was racing with what had just happened, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered within me. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm my nerves, when I heard a knock on my window. I jumped in my seat, my heart racing once again. I cautiously rolled down the window, and to my surprise, it was a homeless man. He looked different now, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to scare you." I eyed him warily, unsure of what he wanted from me, but he continued to speak, explaining that he had been living in the rest stop for a while now, and he didn't mean any harm. "I just wanted someone to talk to," he said, his eyes pleading. I could see the desperation in his gaze, and I felt a twinge of sympathy for him. But at the same time, I couldn't help but feel uneasy around him. I hesitated for a moment before turning to face him. He looked defeated, like he had lost all hope. I could see the pain etched on his face, and it made me feel a pang of sympathy for him. "Why were you in there?" I asked him, my voice gentle. The man sighed heavily, his eyes downcast. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said. "I just don't have anywhere else to go. I've been living here for a while now, trying to stay out of trouble." I listened to him, trying to understand his situation. He explained that he had lost his job and his family had disowned him, leaving him with nowhere to turn. He had been surviving on the streets, scrounging for food and shelter wherever he could find it. I felt a sense of sadness for him, realizing that he was a victim of circumstances beyond his control. But at the same time, I knew that I couldn't let my guard down. He may have meant me no harm, but he was still a stranger. "I'm sorry," I said to him, "but I can't stay here. I have to get back on the road." The man nodded, looking down at his feet. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for the trouble." I got back in my truck and drove away, feeling a mix of emotions. Part of me felt relieved to be leaving the rest stop behind, while another part of me felt guilty for leaving the homeless man behind. I wondered what would happen to him and if he would be okay. As I continued down the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The encounter with the homeless man had left me on edge, and I found myself constantly checking my rearview mirror, afraid that he would follow me. But eventually, the fear faded away, replaced by a sense of determination. I knew that I had to trust my instincts and be cautious of unexpected dangers. The road ahead was long and unpredictable, but I was determined to make it to my destination safe and sound. Number 2. The shipment. For as long as I could remember, I'd been a long-haul truck driver. It was a profession that I truly enjoyed, as it offered me the freedom of the open road and the sense of adventure that came with every new delivery. The steady hum of the engine was a constant companion, and I relished the solitude of my cabin. But this particular shipment was different. When I arrived in the small town to pick up the boxes, the atmosphere was eerie. The buildings were run down and dilapidated, and there was an air of neglect and disrepair that hung over everything. The man who handed me the boxes was shifty and evasive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Despite my unease, I tried to focus on the task at hand. I carefully loaded the boxes onto the truck and double-checked the delivery details. As I set off on my journey, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The desolate roads were dark and silent, and every little sound seemed amplified. My unease grew with every passing mile. I tried to dismiss my feelings as just my imagination running wild, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I kept checking my mirrors, but there was nothing there. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional chirping of crickets. As the night wore on, my nerves began to fray. The sense of unease that had been nagging at me all evening now felt like a tangible presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. I didn't know what it was, but I knew that I had to be ready for it. Suddenly, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, a few yards ahead of me. My heart raced, and I hit the brakes, causing the truck to screech to a halt. I peered out of the window, but the figure was gone. I shook my head and tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I decided to take a break and stepped out of the truck. The chilly air bit my skin, and I shuddered. That's when I noticed that one of the boxes had a slight tear, and something was peeking through it. My hands trembled as I hesitated, then opened the box. My heart stopped as I saw packets of white powder inside. It didn't take me long to realize what it was: drugs. Fear gripped me as I considered my options. I couldn't deliver this cargo. I'd get into trouble. But I couldn't just abandon it either. I decided to turn back and ask the man who gave me the shipment about the drugs. Maybe it was a mistake or a mix-up, but as I drove back, my unease turned to terror. The man was waiting for me, and his eyes were cold as he threatened me. I knew I was in over my head. He told me that I had to deliver the shipment, or there would be consequences. I felt trapped, like a pawn in some twisted game. I tried to argue with him, to reason with him, but he wasn't having it. He was cold, calculating, and ruthless. I knew I had no choice but to obey him. As I got back on the road, I realized that I had made a grave mistake. I had become involved in something sinister, and I didn't know how to get out of it. The only thing I knew was that I had to deliver the shipment, or my life would be in danger. My mind raced as I drove through the night. I couldn't stop thinking about the drugs, the man, and the figure on the road. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and my heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. The silence was deafening, and every little sound seemed amplified. Every time I looked in my mirrors, I felt like something was watching me. My nerves were shot, and I was on the brink of a breakdown. As I drove closer to the destination, my anxiety grew even more. I knew that the delivery was going to be dangerous, and I had no idea what kind of people I was going to face. The instructions I had received were vague, and I didn't even know who the recipient was. I arrived at a run-down warehouse on the outskirts of the city, and a man dressed in a suit approached me. He didn't say a word and motioned for me to follow him into the building. The interior was dimly lit, and the air was thick with the smell of cigarette smoke and sweat. I felt like I had walked into a den of criminals. The man led me to a small room with a table and a few chairs. There were 2 other men in the room, but with serious expressions on their faces. One of them spoke up. "You have the delivery?" I nodded, my mouth dry. I felt like I was in a bad movie, and I was the unsuspecting victim who had stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. The man motioned for me to put the boxes on the table, and I did so reluctantly. The other man started to examine the contents of the boxes, and I felt like I was holding my breath. After what felt like an eternity, the man nodded his head and said, "It's all here." He motioned for the other man to take the boxes. They both left the room without saying another word. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but I also knew that my troubles weren't over yet. I had no idea what kind of trouble I had gotten myself into, and I didn't know if the men would come after me. As I drove, I kept replaying the events of the night over and over in my head. I couldn't believe I had gotten myself involved in something like this. The thought of what could happen if I failed to deliver the shipment was terrifying. But at the same time, I knew that if I did deliver it, I would be helping to perpetuate a cycle of crime and violence. As much as I wanted to call the police and turn myself in, I knew it was too risky. The man who had threatened me was clearly involved in some kind of organized crime, and I didn't want to risk the safety of myself or my family. If I snitched, there was no telling what kind of retribution would be taken against us. I also knew that I was in too deep already. I had made a mistake by accepting the shipment, and now I had to see it through to the end. I had a family to take care of, and I couldn't risk putting their safety in jeopardy. As much as I hated what I was doing, I had to deliver the shipment.